I mean, it's very convenient to survey people, and people are upset about it. But at the same time, governments are keen on this because it's a very cheap measure to create a feeling of security in the general population.
At the very moment when we see deindustrialization in Europe as a result of incredibly high carbon taxation that is killing off the competitiveness of our chemical industry, and the chemical industry is the base of all other industries. I always tell people that are, let's say, more liberal, look, I mean, you don't want the sort of the social conservative side imposing their dominant view on the rest of the EU. So sort of part of the good aspect of the EU is that it leaves some room for experimentation, really, for differences between member states.
So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. I'm Jacob Reynolds, and this week on the podcast we're going to take a look at the EU's reviving of the notorious chat control to spy and snoop on all of your messages. We're going to look at the fallout from COP30 and take stock of decades of failed environmental policy. And we're going to look to the European Parliament where there's yet another rule of law, EU values crusade underway against Hungary. Joining us on the podcast this week, delighted to welcome back our colleague Richard Schenk.
A lot on our plates today, right?
And we're delighted to welcome back a regular guest of the podcast, Pieter Cleppe of the Brussels Report.
Glad to be here.
Before we dive into this week's topics, I want to remind you that if you can be in Brussels or want to be in Brussels next week, 3rd and 4th of December, we have a major conference here in Brussels, Battle for the Soul of Europe. Let me hand over to my colleague John to tell you more.
Europe is at a crossroads. The choices we make in the next few years will decide whether our continent continues to decline or rediscovers its courage. That's why this December 3rd and 4th, some of the most daring thinkers, leaders and patriots are coming together in Brussels.
And if you enjoy watching us on the podcast, we've had great success on many forums at the moment with regards to our video content. But just to remind you that the EU is bringing in all kinds of regulations to make it more and more difficult for conservative voices to be heard. So please, if you enjoy what we're doing on the podcast, like, subscribe, give us a comment, share it with your friends. We really appreciate hearing how you're enjoying the podcast. Right, to kick off with the meat of the podcast this week, I wanted to start with the EU's proposals for chat, so-called chat control. We've covered this before on our channels. There's been a series of proposals to try and they've been stuck in kind of institutional limbo for a while about giving the European Union and member states powers to spy further on what is written and said, including controversially, supposedly breaking the encryption that many services like WhatsApp have used. It seems like some of the harshest parts of the chat control measures have kind of been quietly dropped, but there's been a renewed push to at least bring some of it into fruition. Richard, what do you know about what's going on?
Well, what's again behind this proposal? I mean, it's very convenient to survey people, and people are upset about it. But at the same time, governments are keen on this because it's a very cheap measure to create the feeling of security in the general population. Because it's much easier to control to introduce chat controls than to, for example, actually work on the judicial system, or to have more police officers going into this, or even prevention measures against abuse of children. So these are all very costly measures that most people don't feel because obviously they are not effective, thank God. But on the other side, chat control creates the illusion on basically for everyone that you are surveilled, that something is done in order to prevent this type of crime. But I think this is now a misjudgment of the public mood, because many people are now looking through this. They see that governments are taking these cheap excuses. They're trampling on their rights of ordinary citizens who are not breaking the law, with the excuse of that it's easier to enforce the law for the other ones. But they want actually real measures against real criminality, because there is a problem with child pornography, for example, online. That's a problem.
Pieter, so earlier versions of this proposal have included very draconian things, such as basically making manufacturers install software on your phone that would see messages before they were kind of sent through the encryption that apps like WhatsApp use. It seems that they might have dropped some of that, but there's still both a lot of uncertainty, and even what is on the table is really worrying from a privacy perspective.
It absolutely is, and it looks like they never stop. The Danish presidency had dropped the proposal, they claimed, and then the competent Danish minister even claimed that the opponents of chat control were financed by big tech. So, I mean, they were in desperation. But I think only about a month later, they try again. And now the new tactic seems to be not explicitly forcing the likes of WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram to check your messages and your pictures, all of them, because sometimes they claim, oh, we're only scanning the bad ones, but that's not possible, of course. Now, the new approach seems to be to make those platforms liable in case criminal activity happens. And, even if that may not be 100% legally clear, the risk is that WhatsApp will say, well, just to err on the safe side, we may just start, scanning everything and put that in our, general terms. And, I think it will be interesting to see, first of all, if this passes. I hope not. But sadly, the latest I heard was that there was a consensus in favor of it, or a majority. But I'm curious to see what Signal will do, because they have announced to pull out of the EU market if the EU continues with this.
Yeah, and Richard, in some ways, this is kind of indicative of how the EU works. You have proposals which there's a wide public outcry. They get kind of quietly buried for a while. And then when everybody's distracted with something else, this week maybe Ukraine or something, the proposals suddenly find their way back into the institutional system.
Definitely. I mean, especially the European Council is designed through its institutional setup as a machinery to produce laws. It very rarely completely objects laws. What happens is that they are stalled in the council for years, even decades sometimes. But then suddenly they emerge because there's a certain constellation of national governments that is in favor of it. That's actually quite a strange setup. So there should be some kind of procedural rule within the council to deal with this. Currently, as I understood, the German government is split, and without its votes in the council, there is no majority. The CDU and the CSU are still blocking this chat control proposal, but honestly, knowing these two parties, that's only a thin veil. Most likely, they will find a way to find an excuse to be in favor of it. And I mean, as Pieter said, now the magic solution is to create this liability for private companies, which is now the magic solution of the EU for everything in the digital sphere. So the Digital Services Act, the DSA, created, for example, all these trusted flaggers. So if you don't listen to all these leftist NGOs flagging stuff on your platform, you become liable, for example. This is they're just outsourcing decisions that the state should take. Actually, I mean, persecution of criminal activity is an obligation of the member states' authorities, the polices and district attorneys, and because they are not up to the task, it's easy to push it over to the digital platforms, and the consequences are then suffered by the consumers, as Pieter said, with Signal, one of the currently best services out there on message technology, pulling out of the European market. And we are not enforcing it globally. We are just becoming isolated.
Yeah, well, our viewers can find more on a little bit of what you said there, because we're about to release a brand new report from one of our visiting fellows on the EU's Democracy Shield, which features lots of information on these so-called trusted flaggers. We have a deep dive with Norman that our viewers can go and watch. We'll stick it in the notes. But Pieter, a time when right across Europe there's a sense that governments and the EU is becoming more and more focused on what you say. We've seen in Germany or in Ireland, for example, like very contentious debates about people being arrested for things they've said online. To hand more power, to give up more privacy for our private communication seems to be really quite dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, Richard mentioned the Digital Services Act, all these other, oppressive legislations or, proposals for oppressive laws. And I mean, something big needs to happen, I think. Maybe you need to refound the European Union institutions. It looks like they're completely out of control. Ursula von der Leyen is proposing, her own secret service in-house, which is then being opposed by the EU fake foreign minister, Miss Callas. I think, look, whatever you do, we need to restore the veto powers for member states. So a single veto can block a certain proposal. And I think that's going to be a method to get rid of a lot of the, the negative stuff that we have been witnessing over the last at least 10, but much longer, years. That's just, very important. At the moment, when you have commission proposals, it's incredibly important because once it's on the table, it's going to stay there. So you have to try to shape it before the European Commission even comes up with it. So this is like technocracy on steroids. And whereas this was mostly economically damaging with the EU over-regulating the economy, let's say until 10, 15 years ago, certainly the last 10 years, we see a lot more legislation that is simply violating human rights. This stuff is, I think, violating several national constitutions also. Of course, in practice, when you challenge it, it's not possible to then stop it in this way. But I think we need to really not just stop chat control, but really work on changing the whole machinery to make EU legislation.
Yeah, well, we've seen, we've been involved in this debate already. It's not often we urge our viewers to actually get involved, but we've actually heard quite a lot of comment on this, that many national representatives don't even know this is going on, don't even know if their governments are nominally supporting this, and that it's only been the public outcry in certain countries that's forced them to take notice. So sign the petitions you see online. It is one of those rare instances where this kind of stuff actually is having a bit of an effect. So do kick up a fuss about this, and hopefully we can stop chat control once again. So coming now to COP, we're in the kind of tail end of what was, it seems like, a relatively uneventful gathering of the leaders and talking about climate policy. We published a couple of things on this topic on our YouTube channel, including an excellent interview I did with Samuel Furfuri, which our viewers can go and watch. But Pieter, one of the themes of this COP almost has been the kind of, it's been a bit of a cold shower, hasn't achieved the kind of the presence that previous editions have. Does this suggest that we're maybe finally seeing the tail end of the power of the environmentalist movement?
You would hope so, but in Brazil, the European Commission was campaigning hard for things like carbon taxation, climate taxation, at the very moment when we see deindustrialization in Europe as a result of incredibly high carbon taxation that is killing off the competitiveness of our chemical industry, and the chemical industry is the base of all other industries. Thankfully, the developing countries push back against some of the extremism that European policymakers were pushing in Brazil, according to me, without a proper mandate from European governments. But in the first place, it also begs the question, why even have such a big climate summit? Last year it was held in Baku, a petro-state, sort of an environmental conference dedicated against fossil fuels. That's kind of weird. This year it was in Brazil. Brazil is an agricultural powerhouse. We've all seen the stories about how they were clearing part of the rainforest, which is sort of the symbol of the environmental movement, in order to allow this summit just at the border of the rainforest to happen. I mean, what else do you need to say? But also 75% of Brazil's CO2 emission is coming from agriculture, and a large part of it is from soy cultivation. It's a big industry in Brazil. And it can be really quite bad for the environment, for deforestation, the thing that the EU tries to ban, with its deforestation regulation. And for a long time there was the Amazon soy moratorium, which sort of was a voluntary agreement, actually quite a good thing, between NGOs, private industry, and all the stakeholders to not have excessive damage for the environment when cultivating soy. But at the end of August, just before COP, the Brazilian authorities suspended this. So I mean, like this whole thing is just is verging on the embarrassing, frankly.
I never thought we'd be having you on, Pieter, and you'd be sounding so much like Greta Thunberg. But yeah, but Richard, even if nothing major new was kind of agreed or announced really at COP, we still need to get to grips with all of the damage that's been done by previous commitments and previous things that have been announced.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if we have seen that this is not the first COP. The first, it's a decade-old thing. Actually, the first COP was held in Germany, in Berlin, in 1990s. But what we are talking about is that 4 countries are basically making up half of the greenhouse gas emissions of this world: US, China, India, and Russia. And then you can also count in the European Union, but we are also emitting about 15% percentage points of relevant greenhouse gas emissions. Out of the four big countries, 2 are treated as developing countries: China and India. So they have a lot of exceptions. They can just basically increase emissions. The USA have pulled back, and Russia is a petrostate anyway. So they have no interest in any kind of decarbonization. So now we are stalled because how should the EU take on this leadership? What we are basically doing is that we have adopted an approach as EU, but also the relevant member states like Germany and France, that we are decarbonizing at the price of deindustrialization. And this is not a good example that anyone will follow. The US have recognized that these COP agreements are leading to deindustrialization and the loss of competitiveness in a global competition. This is why they have pulled back. And China was always in favor of these COP agreements because they were the big profiteers of this. The now big industrial leaders are basically restrained, and they, as a developing country, can now then surpass them in any relevant technology. So obviously the Chinese were very much in favor of this. And I mean, the EU's climate leadership and diplomacy is just not able to recognize this very basic truth behind this, and how on earth should be able to develop some kind of global leadership.
And this all comes, Pieter, at a slightly strange moment where actually in the EU there's also discussion about rowing back on some of the kind of climate-related commitments and green kind of legislation that have caused so much damage. So there's almost like a schizophrenic mood where they still kind of talk the language of climate diplomacy and are still pushing for certain things whilst trying to undo some of the damage that's already been done.
Yeah, exactly. So when you have all these double standards in Brazil, thankfully not ending in much, back in Europe, sort of the first steps to deregulate or at least simplify some of the worst excesses of the green regulations have started. They just decided to, postpone the deforestation regulations with 1 year. These regulations are also, let's say, very unfair in the sense that the US is basically exempted because Trump was pushing for it. The palm oil exporting countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, are not. They get all the bureaucracy, despite the fact that they made some progress. Then, of course, there's the CSDDD, the due diligence regulation, basically burdening companies with the responsibility to try to detail their whole supply chain, all kinds of standards. So this kind of central planning is thankfully being withdrawn to a modest extent. But at the end of the day, it's mostly regulations that were not actually already in force that are either being postponed or withdrawn. What really should happen is what I mentioned at the beginning is we should scrap the ETS, the emission trading system altogether, the climate taxation that is burdening our industry so heavily. Because if we want to change our energy system again back to a normal one without all kinds of central planning experiments, that's going to take at least 10 years. Yeah. If we scrap this burden on the energy price, we can liberate our industry today to a material extent.
Yeah, I think is one of the big open questions, Richard, of the future. One of the things we'll actually be addressing our conference next week, because Europe just about manages to keep pace with certain other countries in terms of in industrial production, all the rest of it, even though we're struggling. But the kind of way that European companies and countries are doing this with one hand tied behind their back because of this insane regulation. To liberate Europe in this way would really open up an enormous opportunity for Europe's economy, wouldn't it?
Look at our labor force. In the global competition, Europe is now a cheap labor country almost. Like if you look at relevant fields like IT, medicine, biotech, chemistry, European doctors and scientists are pretty cheap compared to the US. This is why they're all going to the US actually, because they can earn double the wages than here. So that's actually pretty much a very interesting situation, that we have all this skilled labor here. Not everybody has left Europe yet. But because of the energy prices here, we are not able to unleash them, and all the regulation that Pieter has mentioned. There was a very interesting study, if I remember, out of Denmark, that said one of the most cost-effective measures would be if we would, for the top 10% of the incomes, we would abolish any kind of regulations, how they are able to be, how they can be fired from the companies. Because how it works in the US, for example, that Apple or other big companies, they build up whole sections to develop a new product. If it doesn't work, they just fire all these high earning people anymore. They will find a job very quickly, and they are well off because they have high wages. But this is not possible in Europe. So if your product fails in Europe, you are still stuck with all these people in your company and structures that are very, very expensive, and you are dragging your company down in the global competition.
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity. One of these, as I say, one of the things we'd like to get into next week at the conference, because whilst we spend rightly lots of time criticizing all the stuff that's happened under the banner of environmentalism, it also means there's a huge opportunity for Europe. We really could make a massive change just by getting rid, as Pieter said, of some of the worst bits of legislation and freeing up the great companies and individuals in Europe to really succeed. Okay, well, finally for this week, wanted to come back to a story that periodically kind of bubbles up out of the European institutions, which is they're always trying to amass some kind of political majority for taking further action on Hungary. This week's story is attempts in the European Parliament based on another report put together by mainly by activist NGOs, but supported by lots of MEPs, about the way that Hungary is supposedly in breach of fundamental EU values. If you followed our work before MCC Brussels, you'll very much know that we've done a lot of work exposing how EU values have come to mean something completely different to what maybe they might have meant to people who were involved in the creation of the European Union project. But Richard, what's this latest episode in the kind of never-ending saga of anti-Hungarian sentiment, which is really anti-sovereignty sentiment in the European institution?
Well, in April 2026, there are parliamentary elections in Hungary. And this is the opportunity for the anti-Orban forces in the European Parliament to copy and paste everything that they have written before in the last 16 years about Orban and authoritarianism into one single document. So it's a very it doesn't make any sense. In one point, they are talking about elections system, and then the next one it's about media, and then third one is about transgender rights. So every force that is anti-Orban got its fair share of something in this non-legislative resolution. Thank God, it's only non-legislative. And as I see from the perspective of the European People's Party, who is the biggest one, it's a very cheap thing to throw to the lefty forces, because somehow they are very keen on this. The anti-Orban is always good for them, and a non-legislative resolution doesn't cost the EPP anything to side with the lefties. Then they calm down. Also, amidst their own ranks, there are several political parties who are keen on this anti-Orban rhetoric, and it doesn't cost anything. It's just a rhetorical exercise to be against Hungary once again. And in the end of the day, nobody cares, and it has no real consequences.
Yeah, and Pieter, these questions, we bring them up every now and again. There's obviously a Hungarian perspective on this, which is important, but they're actually broader than Hungary. They're kind of almost self-consciously designed to undermine the position of anybody who takes a different position to the EU mainstream.
Well, yeah, every time you have these discussions on singling out a specific EU member state on rule of law, misuse of EU funds, or anything of that, you have people warning for double standards, and I think it's very difficult to deny that that's the case. And what makes Hungary different is that in Romania and Bulgaria you have also I think problems with rule of law. In Western Europe you also have problems with rule of law. What you notice is that member states are ultimately very reluctant to apply some of these measures. Now, personally, I think EU funding is deeply problematic and is vulnerable to abuse. And I always like to mention this report by Vince Musacchio. He's an Italian anti-corruption academic, and he claims that 50%, of the structural funds that were transferred from the EU to Italy between 2015 and 2020 have ended up in the hands of organized crime. That's a senior anti-corruption expert from the Rutgers Institute in the States. I mean, this is very, very problematic, and it shows that not only do these structural funds not help for conversions, the EU single market does that. They have been helping the likes of Poland, for example, but also Hungary, other former East Bloc countries to catch up to a degree. But of course, transferring large sums of money through the state system indeed ended up as everybody could have expected, with special interests. So yeah, you could fairly criticize Hungary, fair enough. But then it's kind of weird that you don't criticize Italy, where you have perhaps much more profound problems, or countries like Bulgaria, Poland, and again, if you want to criticize the lack of independence of the justice system, there's also quite a few European countries, I think, where you can start criticizing. Ultimately, though, I think the best what the EU can do, if there's problems like that, is not to fuel it by transferring large sums of money, and that's exactly what they continue to do. We have this cycle, and it will probably end, like always, with nothing. A lot of circus ending up with nothing, except not what they should be doing, which is to cut EU funds for everybody.
Yeah, well, Richard, there's also a component of values to this, isn't it? It's not just kind of about the management of money or the workings of the court thing. It's the certain issues everyone's familiar with. Some of them, the positions taken on migration, positions taken on the teaching of LGBT for children. Slovakia is currently threatened with various punishments for taking a different line on what constitutes a family and how adoption can work, surrogacy and issues like this. But so it's also that taking a different ideological position, or taking what most people consider a common sense position, is what singles you out for special treatment.
Yeah, no, I mean, what's common sense is determined by each member state's own needs. For example, this report that is currently on the table singles out Hungary for its electoral system. It's not a proportional representation system, which is common in most Central and Northern European states, but it is a system that contains a majoritarian element, so half of the seats are decided in single person constituencies, which is actually a democratic practice in the UK, in France, and but also in Italy. You have at least parts of the parliament that decided on with the same system, and many other electoral systems have majoritarian elements in Greece and Spain and so on. That's a choice that each country makes, usually out of its own constitutional and political traditions. Hungary chose the system actually in 1990. they always single out the Orban government for changing the system in 2012. But the reason for this was that they made the parliament smaller. The basic mechanics of the electoral system are the same since 1990, and only a few changes here and there were made to the core. The core of the system was untouched. Only minor changes were made, and this decision was in 1990 made by Hungary because it reached back even into the 19th century when Hungary was a very similar system to UK electoral system. First past the post. So this was a historical compromise. But for the EU, this is something that is not compatible with EU values. I also actually doubt that if the now opposition leader Pieter would win the elections, they would have any problem with it. Then it would be fine. Pieter is actually boasting on social media about it, that because there are some polls who are showing it in upfront that this would lead to a huge supermajority for him. But this is no problem for the European Union. Obviously, it's just about the political stances of the current government.
Yeah, and basically this is kind of part and parcel of how the European Parliament and other European institutions work, is that you have... and whilst I agree with both of you that this is so far it's kind of a bit of a non-entity of a discussion in a way, but they exist to kind of like lay the groundwork for further action to be taken later. They pass a resolution, prepare a report, and before you know it, you've invited an actual intervention by the more powerful EU institution.
Yeah, and I think what's going on is that when a country leans to the more social conservative side, it's being targeted in this way. And I think that's fundamentally wrong, because these kind of choices should be left to the member state level, because in truth, European countries are actually quite different in that regard. And, in some countries, there's simply, more of a social conservative dominant point of view. And this week we had a court case from the European Court of Justice, whereby it ruled that gay marriage must be recognized across the EU. Now, I'm personally in favor of gay marriage. I'm from Belgium. Maybe that's one of the reasons where this is, I would say, a consensus view.
Yeah.
But I do think it's very important that we respect the dominant view in other countries. Of course, as long as human rights are respected, but you cannot extend human rights to such a degree that they exclude any more social conservative points of view of society. And I always tell people that are, let's say, more liberal, look, I mean, you don't want the social conservative side imposing their dominant view on the rest of the EU. So sort of part of the good aspect of the EU is that it leaves some room for experimentation, for differences between member states.
Yeah, well, no, we'll be following these issues more closely, but for now, that's all we have time for on the MCC Brussels podcast. As I say, do join us in Brussels 3rd and 4th of December for our major conference. There's still a chance to register. All those spaces are running out quickly. But for now, thank you to our guests. Thanks so much, Pieter, for coming in.
A pleasure. Thank you.
And Richie, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much.